Not all fairy tales start with a glass slipper. Some begin with a mop and a bucket. She arrived at the palace with nothing but a worn-out suitcase and a heart full of dreams. The grand marble floors stretched endlessly before her, chandeliers dripping with crystals that caught the light like 1,000 tiny stars. She had never seen such wealth, never imagined a world where silk curtains danced in the breeze, where golden staircases spiraled toward the heavens. And yet, here she was, just a maid in the kingdom of a man she'd only heard whispers about. The staff spoke of him in hushed voices, the mysterious millionaire who owned this palace, powerful, untouchable, a man whose presence could command silence, whose mere glance could make or break a life. Some called him generous, others called him dangerous. But she didn't believe the rumors. How could a man who lived in such beauty be anything but kind? And when he finally noticed her, really noticed her, she felt the world shift. A stolen glance across a gilded hallway, a fleeting touch as he passed by, a voice so smooth, so commanding, it made her pulse race. Was it fate? A dream? Or the beginning of something she'd never be able to escape? Because in this palace, love was not always what it seemed, and neither was freedom. The palace was more than just a home. It was a world of its own, a kingdom wrapped in gold and secrets, where walls whispered stories, and every locked door held something she wasn't meant to see. At first, she moved through its grand halls as just another shadow, just another maid in a place where servants were meant to be invisible. But how could anyone feel invisible in a place like this? The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Ceiling-high mirrors reflected endless corridors, and jeweled chandeliers hung like floating stars, casting a golden glow over the impossibly smooth marble floors. Every room was a masterpiece: silk-draped lounges, dining halls large enough to seat an army, balconies that stretched into infinity, overlooking the endless Arabian desert. It was breathtaking, and yet beneath its beauty, something felt off. She noticed it in the way the other maids never laughed, never spoke too loudly, in the way they stole nervous glances at the tall doors at the end of the West Wing, the only place they refused to go after dark. She noticed it in the way their hands trembled when they prepared the rooms for him. And then, there was him, the master of the palace, the enigma who owned this empire of gold and shadow. His name was spoken with reverence, with fear. Some called him a savior, others a storm waiting to break. He was the kind of man who walked into a room, and the air itself seemed to shift around him. Women held their breath, men straightened their backs. He had a presence that couldn't be ignored, a confidence that came from knowing the world belonged to him. The first time she saw him up close, she understood why no one could look away. He wasn't just wealthy, he wore power the way other men wore silk. Tall, refined, effortlessly commanding. His eyes, dark as the midnight sky, held something unreadable, something dangerous. And yet when he spoke, his voice was smooth, almost gentle, like a lullaby laced with warning. "What's your name?" She hadn't expected him to speak to her, let alone look at her. But he did, and in that moment something shifted. A spark, a recognition. Like the beginning of something impossible, something inevitable. He wasn't like the other men she had known. He didn't just see her, he studied her. He asked questions no master should ask a maid. Where was she from? Did she miss home? Did she ever dream of something more? At first, she told herself it was nothing, a rich man's idle curiosity, a passing interest. But then came the stolen moments. His gaze lingering just a second too long, his voice dropping just a little too low when he spoke her name, and then the first touch, just a brush of his fingers against hers as he took a glass from her trembling hands. But it was enough to send fire through her veins, enough to make her forget, just for a moment, that men like him did not fall for girls like her. And yet, he kept finding reasons to see her. Late at night, when the halls were empty, when the world belonged only to them. He made her feel seen, made her feel special. Like maybe, just maybe, she was more than just a maid. Maybe she was his. But in a palace built on secrets, love could be the most dangerous game of all, because she didn't know what happened to the last woman who caught his eye. She didn't know why the West Wing doors were always locked, and she didn't yet understand the kind of man she was falling for. But she would, and by then, it would be too late. For the first time in her life, she felt seen, not as a servant, not as someone meant to fade into the background, but as a woman, as his woman. It started with stolen moments, brushing past each other in the grand hallways, lingering glances when no one was looking, his voice like a secret meant only for her. He made her feel special in a world where she had always been invisible. The grand palace was filled with the most beautiful women, wealthy socialites, powerful heiresses, models flown in from every corner of the world. And yet it was her he kept coming back to. It was her he sought out in the quiet of the night, beneath the golden glow of the chandeliers, in the secret corners of the palace where the air was thick with unspoken promises. At first, she told herself it was nothing, just curiosity. Just a passing fascination. But then came the invitations, the late-night walks through the moonlit gardens, the quiet conversations on the palace balcony where the desert stretched endlessly beyond them. He asked about her past, about her dreams, about the things no one else had ever bothered to know. He listened. He made her feel like she mattered. And then, one night, everything changed. The palace was alive with celebration, a grand party filled with music, with laughter, with women draped in jewels and men who spoke in hushed tones about fortunes and power. She wasn't meant to be seen, but somehow she found herself there, standing at the edge of the grand ballroom, her heart pounding as she watched him from a distance. He was surrounded by people, yet somehow she knew he was aware of her. And then, suddenly, he was beside her. A whisper in her ear, a question that sent shivers down her spine. "Dance with me." She hesitated. She knew what it meant, knew what the others would say, but when he held out his hand, she couldn't bring herself to refuse, because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the rules, not the warnings, not the fact that she was a maid and he was a man who owned everything she had ever seen. All that mattered was the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel, like she belonged to him. The music swelled. The room faded away, and as he pulled her close, she knew this wasn't just a game to him. This wasn't just a fleeting infatuation. This was something more. And she was already in too deep. The whirlwind of it all left her breathless. One moment she was a servant. The next, she was the woman at his side, the one who had captured the heart of the most powerful man in the palace. And then, just when she thought she had imagined it all, when she thought reality would pull her back, he spoke the words that changed everything. "Marry me." She laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. But when she met his gaze, there was no humor there, only certainty, possession, a promise wrapped in a command. "You belong with me," he said. "You always have." It made no sense. And yet somehow it made perfect sense, because from the moment he had first looked at her, she had belonged to him in ways she couldn't explain. So she said yes. How could she not? He was offering her a life she had never even dreamed possible, a future filled with luxury, with love, with the kind of devotion she had never known. The wedding was like something out of a fantasy, a gown spun from silk and diamonds, a ceremony in a palace where royalty had once stood. And when he kissed her, when he whispered promises against her lips, she believed him. She believed this was her happily ever after. She had no idea that her fairy tale was about to become a nightmare. It happened so gradually she almost didn't notice at first. The little things, the small, almost imperceptible shifts that turned her dream into something else entirely. The first time he told her not to leave the palace, she didn't question it. He said it was for her protection, that the world outside wasn't safe for someone like her. And maybe he was right. Maybe it was easier to stay inside, to bask in the beauty of the home he had given her. Then came the rules. She couldn't speak to the male staff anymore. She couldn't visit certain parts of the palace without his permission. The beautiful dresses he had once showered her with became a uniform, a carefully curated wardrobe of what he wanted her to wear, and when she asked why, he simply smiled, as if the answer was obvious. "Because you're mine," he said, "and I take care of what's mine." She wanted to believe it was love, that his jealousy was proof of how much he cared, but love wasn't supposed to feel like this. Love wasn't supposed to feel like she was walking on a tightrope, afraid that one wrong step would send everything crashing down. The palace, once filled with light, grew smaller. The walls seemed to close in. The golden gates that once made her feel like royalty now felt like bars on a cage. And when she finally tried to push back, when she told him she needed space, needed freedom, he only smiled, as if she had said something foolish, as if she didn't understand the rules of the world he had built for her. "You don't need freedom, Habibti," he murmured, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "You have me." That was the moment she realized she wasn't his wife, she was his prisoner. She tried to fight it. At first, she convinced herself it was all in her head, that she was overreacting, but then she noticed the locks on the doors, the way the guards kept a closer eye on her, the way the maids who had once been her friends now avoided her gaze, as if they knew something she didn't. She wasn't imagining this. She wasn't crazy. She was trapped. And the man she had fallen in love with? The man who had promised her the world? He wasn't going to let her go. Not now, not ever. She had to get out. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning, sudden yet inevitable. Every locked door, every silent glance, every excuse he had given her, it had all been leading to this. She wasn't his wife, she wasn't his partner, she was something owned, a possession kept behind golden gates, wrapped in silk and diamonds, but caged all the same. At first, she had tried reasoning with him. She told him she needed space, that she missed the world outside. His reaction had been swift, cutting, laced with the kind of quiet danger that sent chills down her spine. "Why would you need anything else when you have me?" And that was it. The final warning, the moment she understood that love, in his world, was never about giving, it was about keeping. So she stopped asking. She stopped fighting. She learned to smile, to nod, to act like she was content, but inside, she was planning, watching, waiting. She started with the maids, those who had been there longer, the ones who had seen the rise and fall of women before her. She caught whispers in the kitchen, frightened murmurs in the servants' quarters. No one spoke directly, but the truth bled through their silence. There had been others. Women who had once been loved, women who had once been promised the world, and none of them had ever left. She couldn't let that be her fate. She wouldn't. So she studied every hallway, memorized every schedule, every guard's shift. There were cameras, watchful, unblinking. But she knew where their blind spots were, and most importantly, she knew when he left. He always left. Not for long, never for long, but long enough for her to slip through the cracks of his perfect world and disappear before he realized she was gone. The night of her escape, the palace was eerily silent. The usual hum of life, the distant laughter, the faint music, was gone. It felt like the walls were listening, like the very air was holding its breath. Dressed in the plainest clothes she could find, heart hammering against her ribs, she made her move. Every step was agony. Every creak of the floorboards felt deafening. She kept her breathing shallow, kept her hands steady as she slipped past the sleeping guards, past the doors that had once seemed so grand but now felt like barriers between her and the rest of the world. The gates loomed ahead, her freedom just beyond them. And then, a voice in the dark. "Going somewhere, Habibti." And just like that, she knew. She had never been free, not really, because the one thing she had failed to understand was that he had been watching her long before she ever started watching him. She froze. The breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to shrink around her, the towering palace walls closing in, suffocating her. Her fingers clenched into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. That voice, deep, smooth, laced with something dark, was unmistakable. It was a voice that had once whispered promises against her skin, one that had made her believe in love, in forever. But now, it held something else entirely. Control. "Going somewhere, Habibti?" he repeated, slower this time, as if savoring the moment. She turned, heart hammering against her ribs. He stood there, perfectly at ease, hands in his pockets, watching her like a predator amused by the foolishness of its prey. There was no anger on his face, no rage. That was the terrifying part. He wasn't shocked. He wasn't caught off guard. He had known. She had planned everything, memorized the guards' shifts, the camera angles, every possible escape route. She had thought she was careful, that she had outsmarted him, but she hadn't. He had been ahead of her the entire time, watching, waiting. Her pulse roared in her ears, but she forced herself to speak, to pretend she still had control. "I just wanted some air," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. His lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. "Air?" He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "You think I don't know you by now? That I don't see what you're doing?" She took a step back, but the gates were behind her. There was nowhere left to go. Shh. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch deceptively gentle. "You lied to me, Habibti. That hurts." A chill ran down her spine, not because of the words, but because of how softly he said them, how calm he was, like this was all a game he was still playing, and she was nothing more than a piece on his board. Her mind raced. She had to get away. She had to run. But before she could move, his grip tightened around her wrist, firm, unrelenting, not painful, not yet, but enough to tell her exactly how this would end if she didn't choose her next move carefully. "Come inside," he murmured, tilting his head, dark eyes studying her with quiet amusement. "Let's forget this ever happened." "A command, not a request." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "And if I say no?" His smile didn't waver, but his fingers tightened, just enough for her to feel the promise in his touch. "Then, Habibti, I'll remind you why you said yes to me in the first place." She had a choice. She could walk back inside and pretend, let herself become the perfect, obedient wife he wanted her to be. She could smile, let him wrap his arms around her, let him whisper reassurances in her ear, tell her that she had imagined all of this, that she was safe, loved, that she belonged to him. Or she could fight. For weeks, she had convinced herself there was no way out, that he was too powerful, too untouchable, that no matter how hard she tried, she would always be his. But standing there, staring into his unreadable eyes, she realized something. He had power, yes, he had money, influence, control. But she had something stronger. She had nothing left to lose. The moment he loosened his grip, just for a second, she moved. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She ran. She twisted out of his grasp and bolted toward the gates, heart pounding like a war drum. Behind her, she heard his sharp intake of breath, the clipped curse as he realized what she was doing. She expected him to yell, to order the guards to seize her, but he didn't. He let her run, because he knew she wouldn't get far. The desert air burned her lungs as she sprinted, the fine silk of her dress tangling around her legs, slowing her down. The gates were only a few feet away, just a little further. Just a little. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She barely had time to register the figure before strong arms wrapped around her from behind, yanking her back. A scream tore from her throat, but a hand clamped over her mouth, muffling the sound. Shh, Habibti. His voice right against her ear. Her body went rigid. No, no, no. He turned her slowly, carefully, like she was something fragile, something precious, like he hadn't just caught her trying to escape, like she hadn't just defied him. You almost made me angry, he said, voice velvet smooth, too calm for what had just happened. His hands settled on either side of her face, tilting her chin up so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. But I'll forgive you, because I love you. Tears burned in her eyes, not from fear, not from sadness, from pure, unfiltered rage. You don't love me, she spat. You own me. A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, amusement, and then worse than all of it, satisfaction. That's what you don't understand, he murmured, brushing his lips against her forehead, his grip never loosening. They're the same thing. That was the moment she knew. She would never escape. Not unless she stopped running. Not unless she ended this. He had spent months weaving a cage around her, using love as his weapon, devotion as his chains. He thought she was weak. He thought she was his. But he had underestimated her. He had mistaken fear for submission, and one day soon he was going to regret that. Because if she couldn't be free, neither could he.